Today's episode is about eclectic grief. We want to know what happens when hearing about the 5 stages of grief doesn't make you feel better because they go on and on and on forever. What are we supposed to do with grief? Does it ever end? If yes, when? And if no, what do we do now? We'll get into that today, but first...
Hi, people. Thank you so much for listening. We love bringing you these conversations with experts that we think you should know and remind you all that it's okay to be wrong because we model this for you every single week right here on this podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel, like this episode, and most importantly, hit that notification bell to stay up to date for when the next episode is live. The more of you that engage, the better guests we can get. So honestly, this is for you, not for us. Thank you. Let's get into it.
Welcome to Often Wrong, where we talk to social impact experts and turn being wrong into an exploration of the middle and a chance to maybe get it right.
In a world obsessed with being right, we flip the script on the hard questions and dig into divisive topics like society's unnatural obsession with binaries or who we need to be mad at for gentrification. We might get canceled, but at least we know why. Today's episode is about eclectic grief. We want to know what happens when hearing about the 5 stages of grief doesn't make you feel better because it just goes on and on and on forever. We will get into that today with our special guest. But first, let's just talk about grief for a minute because I feel like this has been an exercise in grief since 2020, if not before, but definitely since 2020. And I think there's just so many ways that we're experiencing that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And, I think the ways that we, talk about grief and have been experiencing it culturally and communally and at all the different levels is very unique. But it doesn't feel like it's new. It feels very old in many ways, right? I think there's so much that's left unprocessed, unhealed, unresolved. And I think it starts with properly grieving what has happened. I think there were moments coming out of the pandemic in particular, you mentioned 2020, coming out of that, it just felt like, oh, let's just ignore the fact millions of people died and we're going back to restaurants and we're sitting down and it's great. Like, it's not that grief should have looked any kind of certain way necessarily, but it is, I think the space allowed for it. It almost just felt like, oh, leave it. Like, let's just go. Let's just forget that happened. Let's, do the thing that's right in front of us instead of, processing that pain. And I think it's a really, prevalent feeling in any society, I imagine, that feeling of collective grief, depending on what you're going through in, non-peace times, which is, I would say, most times now. But it's a really interesting kind of way to experience, I don't know, things that we're all going through.
I totally agree with that. Honestly, just bringing this topic up is making me think of, I think this was like Christmas 2020, and me and my partner went into New York and we were like, let's do a thing. We'll go look at the lights and we'll have dinner. And we go look at the lights. It's freezing cold. Then we go to dinner and they're serving the same food, same price, but on paper plates. And we had to sit outside and it was freezing. And then we just both were crying. We were like, this is the worst Christmas ever. And I'm just like, what is that if not grief? And even that whole, there was so long where everyone was like, let's get back to normal. And I feel like that's what grief comes through for me as in every situation where you just want to get back to what it was. And you can't really when such large scale things happen.
Yes, absolutely. It's so interesting to me to think about all of the different things that prompt grief and how I think oftentimes we can fail to recognize what grief is. Like that example was great. I think for me, I think about one really poignant example when I was about to get engaged in 2021 and my whole system, and I've not ever really been a marriage person. I am married now, but like it's not something I ever aspired to. And it just, I was kind of like, oh my God, I'm so young. And, you know, I don't know. And it felt right, but I just had this like deep feeling of, oh my goodness, like this is ending. Like my childhood is ending. And it was so strange because I was sitting with my mom and I was explaining to her, like, you know, I just feel this like sadness, this like deep pulling down, like just something's different. And I was staying in my childhood home at the time, in my childhood bedroom. And I was just like, this is too weird. Like, how am I, you know, getting engaged? I'm like 24 years old, 25 years old. No, I was 24 years old. I'm like 24 years old and I'm sitting in my childhood bedroom and I'm just sad, but this is like, you know, the love of my life. Everything's right. And my mom said, you know, this sounds like grief. And I said, oh shit, you are right. This is grief. It felt like grief. I was grieving that time in my life, that like, you know, childhood. I'm in my childhood home. It's all amplified. And it was such a profound, like, oh shit moment. That is grief. I think about that a lot. And I think about, you know, again, other things that prompt grief. Ending of an era, even if there's a lot of joy that comes with it. You know, obviously loss in any way, shape, or form can prompt grief, but just change generally. I think there's so much to that. And I'm really interested to dig into that. And also, you know, I'm really interested to dig into all of the ways that grief kind of connects to the themes that we're exploring this season in healing, fear, how we're talking about things, how we're talking about all of these things. But, you know, I think there's guilt, there's regret, anger, all of the things. Like, there's not any one thing that grief is, but it's also not exactly not these things either, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it's going to be really interesting to have this conversation, and I'm really excited to chat through it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally feel that as a person who's about to get married. I totally feel that. This is like a world is ending. It's also very happy. A world is starting too, but it's different. And I don't know that world yet. So that's really interesting. But then really even also things like war at home or abroad, inflation, how you thought about the government, how you thought about your family, how you thought about everything, just having that rocked a little bit. I can't imagine that being anything but grief. It takes over so much. We're like, wait, what? Really? Like, I was certain that it was like this. And now I just found out that it's like that. So I think grief is such a broad topic, and I feel like it gets reserved for like funerals, but it's actually all around us. And I don't know, that just made me think of that like Love Actually quote where it was like, love is actually all around us. But doesn't that mean then grief is actually all around us all the time too?
Yes. Brilliant. Grief actually is all around us. Let's make a movie. Grief Actually. It'll do great in the box office. I have no doubt about
It's
that.
about grief.
Yeah, honestly, it is completely about grief.
I'm gonna write to them.
So right. Oh my God. No, I mean, it's completely true. And, you know, when you were talking, I started to think about loss of innocence as another, you know, kind of like maybe one of the first waves of grief that we go through as kids, as adolescents, you know, or in adolescence. To me, that's a really profound one. I remember being in school and reading about, you know, all of these themes, and loss of innocence would always come up. And I would be in like 5th grade and I was like, when's what? Like, loss of innocence. Like, was I ever innocent? And then, but I now remember specifically the times that I felt awoken to I'll just get real dark real quick. Humanity's capacity for cruelty and, you know, what we were witnessing. And even at a young age, what I was aware of and what I felt moving through the world. I mean, being really, really young, being really little. And like, even I have memories 7, 8 years old that it was just, I was just aware. And so now in hindsight, I can see, oh, that moment, that shift. But I remember being in it, like, what do you mean loss of innocence? Like, I know things, you know? And
Yeah.
so it's so interesting to think about, again, all of that is a part of grief and what dangers exist if we don't give grief the proper space, the proper attention, and the need for, you know, hey, heal. Let us heal.
Totally. Well,
Yeah.
I'm so glad that we have our guest today because I think it's the perfect one. We have today Jessica Dore. This is, I think, everyone's favorite tarot reader. She is at the Jessica Dore on all social media. She's a social worker and the author of Tarot for Change, which was published in 2022 by Random House. So she is just one of the most insightful people I've ever met. I love talking with her, and you know, I've known her for a long time. Claire, I'm so excited for you to meet her today so we can dig into this because I talk to her a lot, but not necessarily about this. But this is one of her focuses right now, is talking about eclectic grief is what she called it. So I'm really excited to dig into that a little bit. I think this kind of messes with the format of our baby podcast because typically at this point, we would be trying to comb through something, which we are going to do today. But grief isn't really an issue to be solved. And I mean, maybe it is. We can ask Jessica about that and she'll let us know if so. But it also just didn't begin anywhere. And it wasn't really created by anyone. So now, I guess in this part of the podcast, we'd ask the question, when did this start? Who was harmed by it? Who's helped? And I think so far, the answers are that it started when people started. Everyone is harmed by it, but maybe people are also helped by it. And we can find that out maybe today.
Yeah. I would go ahead and add to that grief is a fundamental part of the human condition. It
Totally
really is. And, you know, if we think about the things that make us, you know, sentient beings, how we handle pain, how we handle loss, how we handle change, like that is explicitly, you know, one of the things that people have written about, talked about, you know, made art about, tried to communicate for, since the dawn of time, when humans were around. And, you know, it's certainly, as a human, something that I have never not seen in another human being.
Totally.
Everyone has experienced grief, whatever.
But not everyone acknowledges it. So
exactly. And maybe that's the conversation, because grief is it's a fact of life, but it's how we talk about it. So who's harmed by not talking about it? Who's harmed by not, you know, allowing grief to exist? And, you know, one of the things that I think about is just a really, I think, important way to think about grief when you're in it, like active grief. And I've experienced this in many different ways, but specifically loss-related grief, death and loss. I have felt that grief forces presence like nothing else. And I would love to talk to Jessica about that today, because when you're in active grief, you can't not be present. You have to be with it. And it's so all-consuming. You can't look away from it. It's not, you know, if you scroll on TikTok for 10 minutes, it's still there. It's not, you know, and also 10 minutes, LOL, 60 to 90 minutes, you know, it's still there. It's still there. And it's not something you can stymie very well. But, you know, what happens when we don't allow it to have the space that it needs, to take up that space, and to, really grow and breathe and transform and do what it needs to do. Because I think it's an interesting kind of problem to have when you are stuck and you stop healing. And I think most things in this world, I can, at least for me, I can link back to, unhealed, like from huge, things. Like, for instance, I'll pull out, genocide, tragedy, slavery, tragedy, like horrific things that we have not healed from as a society.
Totally.
One of the things I really, try to talk about when I talk about those things is what it looks like, or what it would look like if we had healed, like, properly, and for the slavery example specifically, if Reconstruction had actually worked, there had been reparations, there had been, things, okay, we've healed, we've grieved, we've allowed, that space, and not in a woo-woo way, but like a literal, we are intentionally making amends for what happened. We are allowing collective grief to unfold for, everyone that means. And we are meeting the moment with healing. If that had happened, we probably wouldn't be talking about inequity and inequality the ways that we have to now, because it still exists rampantly.
Wait. You just solved society. I think we can end the podcast here.
I think I did. I think if everyone just healed,
yeah,
that,
I sounds
think
lovely.
I think we'd fix it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, mic drop.
Wow.
That's it.
Incredible. Well, you mentioned the beginning of the dawn of time, and I think that can be dated back to 1969 when the Kubler-Ross 5 Stages of Grief were published. I think that's like
1969 was a wild year.
We went
1969 was a
1969.
wild year.
I know that from Even Stevens. But the 5 Stages of Grief, I think, are how people know what grief is. I think that's like mainly the thing that people know, which is so funny because people hate it so much. Mm-hmm. And I think that's crazy because it really is. At first it was like, well, I've done the 5 stages. Is it over? Mm-hmm. And then it's not. Mm-hmm. And then it's like, no, it's cyclical. And you're like, well, why? Well, what was the point of these then if we're just going to keep doing them? And they're like meshed together and you do a couple at the same time. And like, so that's my baggage with the 5 stages. But
So the other thing that I find really interesting about the 5 stages, there's a lot more conversation happening about grief right now. And we're re-examining why that became such a, huge kind of part of society and just in the lexicon. It just, people just know it, which is kind of crazy. But the 5 stages of grief were actually intended to be very specific for people who were dealing with terminal diagnoses. Ooh. And very specific to what you're experiencing yourself and that kind of grief. So I have not dealt with anything like that. I can't speak to the accuracy of what that looks like, but it was meant to be very specific. And then we had something that was, intentional and applicable to one thing. And then people just took it and ran with it. And then now we're in this moment where it's like, oh no, that doesn't apply. And Kubler-Ross is probably over here like, well, that was never meant to be applied the way that you're applying it. So it's really interesting to think about, okay, well, why, if that was so specific, why haven't we evolved much past that? Why haven't our conversations about grief and healing become more robust? Why haven't they become more specific? Where is that lacking? And I
have an answer for that.
Oh, let's hear it.
I think this is true about a lot of things and probably most of the topics we're going to talk about this season. But I think for so many things, people think that thought is closed and that when you heard, it's like, oh, well, Five Stages of Grief was thought of and it was published. So that's the end of it. And this is what it is. And you can just deal with that or move on. But there's actually like, you can progress. You don't even have to have a PhD to be the person who's like, wait, I have an idea. And it can keep going. But I think, especially, I would say specifically for the culture in the US, we get kind of stuck on what has already been said, and we think that that's all.
Well, I think with all of that and having established that grief has so many facets, I think it's time to bring in Jessica. What do you think, Lisa?
I totally agree. I am so excited to welcome to the podcast Jessica Dore. Jessica Dore is a social worker. She's also probably your favorite tarot reader. She's at the Jessica Dore on all social media. And she also published and is the author of Tarot for Change, which was published in 2022 by Random House. She also puts out this newsletter called Offerings, which is probably the most profound thing you could ever receive in your inbox. So that is on Substack, and let's get into it.
Here's some tips and tricks on how to be often wrong from your hosts, Lisa and Claire. First, don't like this podcast. 2, never subscribe to this podcast. And 3, definitely don't hit the notification bell to get notified about new episodes. And once you're done all that, we can get back into the episode.
Okay. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Lisa and Claire. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you here.
We're
Honestly,
so excited to have you.
Are the perfect first guest for this podcast. I know you are a person that I can just like ramble on and on with forever. And I feel like we've done that many times. It's one of the most valuable parts of my life. But today we're going to be focused on one topic, which is just an interesting experiment for this opportunity with the podcast.
Yep. I'm excited.
I already introed you before you got here. But do you want to intro yourself? I want to know what you would say about yourself.
Okay. Wow. Great question. What would I say about myself? I am a writer. I wrote a book about tarot cards, and psychology. I also write sort of processual, meandering newsletters, I guess is really the best way to call them, because that's the format that they are on Substack. I have a Substack called Offerings, where lately, for the last about year and a half, I've been writing about grief and mourning and loss. And what else do I do? I'm a social worker. I'm a licensed social worker. I've worked as a therapist. I trained as a therapist. I read tarot cards. And yeah, I'm a human with a dog that likes to ride horses and cook and do all kinds of other things. And yeah, I guess those are the most salient things for this context.
Yes.
I love that. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Me too.
Me too. So just in general, I've always really loved the way you think about things. How you think about tarot changed all of that for me. How you think about the world, the DSM, what you think about psychology, myths, and honestly now, because I read all of your newsletters, how you think about grief. Because Claire and I were talking about how grief is it's everything all the time. And I don't think it gets acknowledged as such, and it should be. And I feel like you are consistently putting that message out there, like, hey, this is what's happening to you right now. And I think that's really helpful. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. I know it's really interesting. Like I've been doing the last few months, I've been doing more, I kind of go in and out of doing like tarot card reading. Like that was kind of a thing that I started doing after leaving my full-time job in 2016. And while I was in graduate school, I was kind of supporting myself that way. And I kind of go in and out of doing it, but it's been really interesting this last like round of tarot sessions, like working with people and just realizing how, how often people really are claiming that they're grieving various things, like really far beyond bereavement or some of the, kind of I mean, I would say maybe bereavement is like the thing that people tend to kind of associate with grief, that if you're grieving if someone that you love died, or someone that you were close to or that was significant to you died. But I've really noticed that people are really taking that up as a name for an experience that they're going through, in relation to all kinds of losses. I mean, so many different things. And that's been really, really, really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm wondering if you can give us an overview just of the concept of eclectic grief specifically and what that means.
Yeah. I mean, thank you for pulling that phrase or that concept. Like, I don't know that I have a super clear way of like describing it. It's just like a set of words that I've been playing with as a way to I guess just try to draw attention to, not draw attention to, maybe cast a wide and vibrant net for like what a grief process can look like. And like, I think I have this like idea or this desire to articulate grief and mourning, and like various ways of responding to losses in ways that would like, it's hard to say like make them enticing, because like often people are going through really, really horrible things that like it would be kind of like, you know, like unthinkable to like say this is going to be somehow enticing to be going through this thing if you've gone through this horrible loss or violence or whatever the case might be. But like, I think just like for me, when I've been in times of acute grief, I've really wanted something that could make me feel like I was part of a larger, like a creative force that was almost erotic, like drawing me into this like really engaged, like sort of low to the ground embodied process of trying to make sense of what I'm going through and what loss is and death, like broadly construed. So the phrase eclectic grief is kind of like just one way of like pointing to a desire that I have to think about and flesh out and articulate just like a really broad, vibrant way of thinking about what grief is, can be, might be, could be, and all that.
Yeah. I love how you talk about it as an embodied process, like that close to the ground. I know what you mean. It's very all consuming is not the right word, but it's embodied. It's fully embodied. And I think that's so interesting. You know, I also, and I think I'm just trying to establish some of the lexicon, some of the like terminology too, just around all of this stuff. And, you know, on Often Wrong, we're focused on how we talk about things and how things show up. And I think the language around it is so important. And like you were saying, you know, more people are using terminology around grief to describe, you know, experiences outside of just loss. So one of the things that I have heard from you is talking about the kind of differences between grief and mourning. And I've heard you describe mourning as engaging imaginatively with what has been lost. And I love that framing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the differences between the states of mourning, like the state of mourning and the state of grief.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I feel like I want to say before I respond to it that I've been having this conversation with people a lot lately, which is that I have been reading a lot and thinking a lot about grief and mourning this past year and a half especially, but I feel like I'm really, really, really brand new in this field. Like, it's such a rich field. There's a lot of amazing work that people have done, really, really super thorough and rigorous thinking about exactly what you're asking, like these distinctions. And like, I feel like a total, like, it's actually a really intense experience to be kind of like in a territory that I don't feel like I have a lot of competence and proficiency in. and yet also to be writing a lot publicly about the things that I'm reading and trying to do so always really tentatively and like with a lot of humility that like, yeah, I'm sharing these things because I'm interested in them. I'm reading them. I want to point people to these books and resources because I'm reading them and finding them really valuable. But yeah, so I have to kind of preface like everything with that, and that language around like imaginative engagement. Actually, like there's a couple of people that I want to kind of call out. One is Kathleen Higgins, who is a philosopher that wrote a book about aesthetics and grief and mourning and kind of the ways that people engage art practices, music, writing, like all kinds of sort of, eclectic ways of grieving. And she was referring to another person named Jonathan Lear, who's a philosopher as well and a psychoanalyst who has a book called Imagining the End, where he's talking about, this just like the way that the meaning making that we engage in during mourning is, in a sense, like constitutes our flourishing as humans. And so I want to say that like that language that you kind of like cited as me saying, really is so like comes from those two individuals, not that it's limited to them, but like, and also just to kind of situate myself as a person who's like, trying to read really closely, trying to be respectful of how like much depth people really like these people are like have spent decades like parsing these distinctions. It's incredible. So anyway, very long-winded intro to the question or to my response to the question. But I think important. So the differences, I mean, when I think about the differences between grief and mourning currently, like I think there are, again, some like people who I think there's varied opinions about these differences. They're parsed. They're like pulled apart in really like intricate ways. For me, I think of grief as like it's an experience of loss, and then the mourning is sort of like the expression of like how one is like almost the grappling process with, trying to negotiate the experience of like having this, like maybe what would be considered like an internal experience of loss, and then also living in a world where, like often is the case with something like a breakup or a death of somebody that you're very close to or that you live with, like you're living in a world where there's all these things that are set up that sort of implicate that person. Like you have habits, or like maybe you, are used to like seeing this person when you come home at night or something like that, and they're not there. Like, so the mourning it's like what it looks like, the grappling with like trying to negotiate that, like you're having this experience and also you're living in this world that in a way implicates this person who's gone, and trying to slowly over time, like reorganize and reconstruct a life, with this new or different or like transformed relationship with them. And there's all kinds of ways that people do that, of course, like, some of which like are really interesting to think about, but yeah.
Yeah, that was great. I think that was so helpful to hear. And, I think how you've, obviously brought in so many other philosophers, thinkers, and experts in this field. I think it's probably a natural time to talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, some of the other folks who have made major contributions to this field. And, Often Wrong, again, is all about evolution, growth. It's not, if it was then and it's not now, great. It's all just learning and growing. And I appreciate you, kind of grounding your own experience and expertise in humility. And, this is really one of those topics that it's a deeply human thing to experience grief. And it's, we can all have opinions about it. We can all have relationships to it. We will all have different relationships to it. And so, I love how you're able to bring in all of these, huge people to the conversation and then distill it down and be really human about it. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I would love to talk about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the 5 stages and why that might not be right anymore, and what that looks like now.
Yeah. Wow. Thanks for that question. I know, I'm like, yeah. And here's Jessica Dore, like critiquing Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, who started studying grief a year and a half ago. Cool. But no, I appreciate the question. Yeah.
People want it.
People want my hot take that I like have no business like offering.
We already gave ours, and we
already gave ours,
so,
and we're definitely more wrong. So you're going to be more correct than we are.
Okay,
so
cool,
you're good.
Cool. As long as I'm winning, then that's all that matters.
Yes, you're going to come out on top. Promise.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So like, would I say that like that model, like so like the 5 stages of grief, or the stages of grief, I don't know if it's only 5. I think maybe they expanded it or something, or I'm not totally sure. But like the stages model, would I say like that's not like the way anymore, or that's not like, no, like, and I mean, I am a social worker, and I like strongly identify as a social worker. Like I feel like so much of the work that I do is like, I care about the applicability of ideas. I care about a model like the stages of change. I just hear people reference it a lot. And to me, that's like, that means something to me, like I'm talking about average, everyday people who are grieving, if that's something that, there's this idea of like, like narrative and like scaffolding, like sort of having an idea about grief when you're in the middle of the chaos of acute grief. Like it's incredibly helpful. It can be incredibly helpful for people. And not all scaffolding is created equal or equally as like helpful and constructive. But I know that the stages model is like widely used, and that people find it helpful and stuff. So I wouldn't be in a position to say like anything about that like is, like not right or something. Also, yeah, like I said, I have no business doing that. But one thing that I do think is interesting in like what I've been reading, there's a person named Matthew Ratcliffe who wrote a book called Grief Worlds, and he's looking at like grief from like a phenomenological like lens. And I can't really speak competently to like what exactly that means, even though I've read the book and I'm now reading it a second time and trying to like understand more of it. But one thing that I do take away from how he's thinking about grief that I think adds to maybe a stages of grief model is the relational component, is the like experiential world component of grief. Like the stages of grief, what are they? Denial, bargaining, anger, depression, acceptance, and possibly, yeah. And so like those are like states that are describing like an emotion with the assumption that the emotion is sort of an individual, like a bounded experience that's like happening inside the individual body. And, you're kind of, it's like a private thing. Right. And so what I'm really interested in is like philosophers who are looking at the ways that grief and other emotions are like much more complicated than that. They're relational. They're being conditioned by our environments. They're connected to the things that we value. They give our lives coherence in a way, like all of these different things. And so I think that would be maybe one thing that I would just say, like, it's like an area where I would wonder like how, like working with a stages of grief model, like I would wonder like how to also account for just like the relational world and how that plays into a grief process. Cause I don't know how well, I like don't know a ton about that model also. So like maybe they do really attend to that super well, and I just don't know, but that's something that I would like wonder about. And I think there's people who are doing really, really interesting work in that area now. Like for example, and this is like not Matthew Ratcliffe, but there's another philosopher named Amy Harbin who wrote a book about disorientation, which is a topic that is very related to grief, because often when people are in acute grief, they're disoriented. And she just sort of a simple example. It's not simple, but like an example that she gives is how, like, if I'm telling someone about an experience, say I'm telling someone that I'm angry, maybe I'm grieving and I'm angry. If the person that I'm telling is uncomfortable with anger for whatever reason, and they are reflecting back to me everything but the aspects of anger that I'm saying to them, that actually changes my experience of the anger. It doesn't just like invalidate my feelings. It actually like changes how I experience the thing. And so that's just an example of like a relational dimension of emotion that, again, I would say like people are doing really interesting work that I think kind of can maybe thicken or, I don't know, like complexify like a model like the stages model that kind of are just looking at individual feelings and thinking of them as individual private experiences.
Totally. I love all that. I also love how you remember the names of all of these brilliant thinkers off the top of your head.
I'm obsessed
really
with them.
impressive.
I'm like their fan. That's why, like,
That's amazing.
it's kind of embarrassing,
t-shirts.
but yeah, these are my celebrities.
Yeah. I love. I mean,
so
honestly,
great.
the thing that you said about scaffolding, I thought was really interesting because I was never thinking about grief ever. And then in 2018, I was about to move to New York, and my therapist at the time told me that I was pre-grieving. And I thought that was so crazy because I had never considered grief about anything except for death, and I didn't know anyone who died. So, but then it's kind of like since that moment in 2018, it's been like nothing but grief. And then for a million reasons that are about my life and reasons that are about like existence in the world. And so I always think that's really crazy. And then when I think about the 5 stages, then it starts to be like, well, if it's about everything all the time and every single day, I can find an instance of acceptance or depression or anger and bargaining. Like I do all of these things all the time. And then at what point are they stages? And then they're just like, well, that's just who you are. So that's why I struggle with that because it's like a roadmap that I feel like I don't understand where I would exist on it at any point in time.
Yeah. I mean, I think like this is the tricky part about like eclectic grief or like thinking about these like, you know, really broad construals of the word grief, for instance, or mourning. It's like, okay, but like how do we like, you know, like make those constructs expansive enough to be like useful and generative while at the same time not making them meaningless. This is like a Byung-Chul Han moment, like Lisa, like, you know, it's just like, this is now like words do mean things actually, like, and you don't actually just get to say like, oh, this is like, I'm just grieving all the time because I was angry today, you know, or whatever, like that, because that's, then it's, I mean, I don't know. It's like, I guess it's fine, but like, what is it doing, you know? And, so that's where it's tricky. That's something that I'm trying to figure out myself.
Totally.
Yeah. I think that's really, really profound because I've thought a lot about like what labels really do and like how is it productive to label this as something? And sometimes it is. Sometimes it's when you don't know, like Lisa and I were talking about, when you don't know you're grieving and it's helpful to go, oh, that's what I'm feeling. This is grief. This is like something's ending, something that didn't, you know, register as grief to me or register as loss to me. That's what's happening. And that can feel very validating. But then it's almost like you can get into a kind of cycle where you're trying to overanalyze every little thing that is coming up for you. And you're like, oh, why would I, you know, I felt a little anger here. Like you said, you know, is that grief? And it almost loses its meaning if we start to over prescribe that to ourselves. And, you know, when I think on social media, we've certainly seen, I mean, the rise of so many different terms from like that have been therapized, right? Like if I hear somebody misuse gaslighting again, I'm going to lose my damn mind. It's just this thing that just pops up. So I think it's really in some ways very good that it's becoming, a bit more tangible for people to go, oh, okay, that's what I'm holding on to. But I think too, when there's so much unresolved pain and unresolved, trauma and things at a societal level, at a, cultural level, it's easier for us as individuals to just cling to all the things that were being thrown because it's like, I can't deal with the big ones. So I'll take this because it does feel right. And it's hard to apply that at a much larger, level, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say, well, 2 comments. One I wanted to make about Byung-Ho Chan, who Jessica and I are big readers. And he has many books about many diverse topics, deep dives into like the most niche topic you could ever think about. And it's really delightful to read. So maybe we can get him on this podcast as well. And we'll bring you back for that so you can join the conversation.
Oh my God, I would love that.
Well, whatever he wants to talk about. Yeah. I'd be like, open forum.
Yeah, he would destroy all of us. I'm 100% sure.
We would all leave feeling like full idiots.
Absolutely. 1,000%.
You'd be like, actually, not only are you often wrong, you are 100% wrong.
Yeah.
Stop that.
About everything.
Yeah.
About literally everything.
Literally.
Oh my
Since
God,
you
I
woke
love
up
that.
this morning have been nothing but wrong.
So one of your offerings, probably from a couple months ago, you described the difficulties of building 6-legged kinships with a horse and with your dog. And I think it's so beautiful how you have realized that these interactions, and I guess what I took away from it, that, these interactions, these relationships are not just there to make you feel unconditionally good and not to like have to think about it. And, I said this at the beginning, but I really feel like grief is one of those things that forces presence. If you're in active grief, you are, it's almost forced presence. You can't like get a break from it. You can't distract yourself from it. It's just there and it demands attention. And I think that is really very similar to really any intimate, meaningful relationship. And that's why those things can be so hard when we're dealing with unprocessed shit. But relationships with animals, especially horses, as a horse person myself, I am a mom to 2 horses, and you can't not be wholly present when you're with them. They just won't allow it. Their systems are like, and their energy fields are like, no bullshit here, and we will leave if you bring your bullshit here. So, in my experience, I've found that, both grief and relationships with animals, like there's a lot of overlap there, I think. And, they both, I think, give me what I need and not what I want, necessarily. Yeah. So I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit more in your own words after I just talk about it.
Thank you so much for talking about it and bringing that in. I mean, I would say that like the 2 big areas of interest for me the last couple of years have really like, I feel really fortunate that because I can be very promiscuous in the things that I'm interested in thinking about and reading about and stuff. So when I have times that I'm really focused on like 1 or 2 things, it feels like quite a relief, like, oh, cool. I have a thing that I'm just like not losing interest in for a sustained period of time, which is awesome. So yeah, like I would say in addition to grief and mourning and loss, like interspecies relationships have been really top of mind for me, just through having them, and being curious about them and like having a lot of difficult experiences with them too. And yeah, what is there to say? Like, I think it is a hard thing kind of to talk about because of the temptation to want to like impose meaning or like extrapolate in a way that would be like, here's what, these relationships like have to teach us about human relationships or something like that, like something that almost makes them like for the purpose of like our benefit or something like that, which is, as you said, right? Like, it's like, that's like not what these relationships are for. They're like on their own, just like really rich sites of world making. And yeah, I mean, I guess like that's kind of what it comes down to. I think like when you are in the throes of like having experienced the loss of a world, like as in the loss of like, you know, like, yeah, like a world that you shared with someone that was very specific to you and that person in the case of bereavement or a breakup or, you know, for whatever reason, like losing someone in your life. I think like relationships are so important as a part of like the process of grappling with those losses, and relationships that are like steady and witnessing and consistent, like not necessarily yeah, I don't know. I'm struggling to talk about it because I feel like I'm like doing the thing that I don't want to do, which is like idealizing what it's like to have friends that are horses or dogs. Because like my dog is kind of a difficult dog. And so like when I was like in acute grief, I was like, he was more difficult than ever. And I have a friend who says that like, you know, your dog's like often in the time when you're most strapped, like will be the most difficult. And we think that the dogs are going to be like so like sweet to us and cuddly and they're going to soothe us, and it's like no, they're annoyed. They can tell that you're off, they're off, now they need more from you, you don't have it to give, and somehow you have to figure out a way. But yeah, and then the horse too, like I mean I was riding a horse and feeling very, as you said, like how embodied grief is, like how visceral it is, and then like to be having this like really deep experience of like a somatic disorientation, and then to be on a horse when for me, like I didn't grow up riding horses, so I don't have a ton of confidence or comfort on a horse. So like, yeah, I was like already not the most confident. And then being in that state on the back of a horse, and then the horses too, like they're super sensitive. So then they're like kicking and like doing all kinds of things. And you're just like, not now, dude. Like, but of course, like they're not there to like be your, you know, therapist that holds you in unconditional high regard or whatever. Like they're their own beings. So yeah, I don't know. Thanks for asking that. Cause I love animals more than human animals, and dogs and horses especially. Yeah. And I just feel that there's such, I don't know, it's like being, I'll say one last thing, which is that I think something that for me that came up a lot, and I think comes up for a lot of people, like a lot of people will talk about going through a really intense grief experience and the way that you kind of lose people a little bit, like when you're really struggling for a sustained period of time. And like it's really necessary for a lot of people to struggle for a sustained period of time. But like a lot of people sort of like, it seems, it just like, this is totally like anecdotally or like reading things on the internet or whatever, but like I gather that people commonly experience like less social support as time goes on because people have a hard time engaging, like, oh my God, you're still like crying every day and it's been 3 months or whatever it is. And like I do think that and this is complicated because animals are like, yeah, they're like living in we're like not horses and dogs, like they're like living in this like human world. They don't really like have a choice, and that's kind of hard, but like they are these like really steady like accompaniers, and they don't go like away. And it's complicated because they don't have agency. They don't have the agency to go away, which is like a tricky thing, and like should be acknowledged. But also like, yeah, there is something really like helpful, like just honestly about that when you're really in it and you need friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should have another episode about interspecies relationships.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So, Jessica, in your learnings, in your studies, what did you get wrong about grief? Is there anything that comes up for you? And if not, because that's okay, we're often wrong. You don't have to be. But what do you think other people get wrong about grief? Or do you think people get anything wrong? Is this a thing that you can be wrong or right about?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you can be wrong or right about it. I'm probably not. Again, my disclaimer: like, I'm probably not the right person to be saying. But I appreciate the format of the show, and I'm trying to get out of my own like fixation with not being wrong, which is in the spirit of the show. I should be trying to get a little more comfortable with, but also I'm like, trying to find a balance. So what have I gotten wrong about it? I don't know. I mean, a lot of things, I'm sure. I don't know how to really answer that question in a way that will be interesting to anyone. I think the only thing I can say is like, I feel like reading about grief. I like a big field that I've been reading in is philosophy of emotion, which is like just a really interesting area where people are interrogating like just like really basic assumptions about how emotions are theorized about and thought about and assumed. And then there's like all this other stuff that like is just like all this other theory that's like based on these like assumptions about what an emotion is and like so on and so forth. So like they're very consequential. And then if you go in and you try to like, try to like pick those apart a little bit, like it can kind of like change the entire ground of like what we're talking about when we're talking about emotions, if that makes sense. So I think there's a lot that I've gotten wrong. I would say for starters, just like the idea of like an emotion as I was saying earlier, like how individual emotional experience is and that like can expand to, like how like I'm sure I've very much thought about like going through a process of grief or disorientation or kind of any of the like related states, like as something that I'm kind of going through by myself and like not necessarily having as much awareness about like the ways that those experiences are being conditioned by the environments that I'm in.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation today. I mean, when else were we going to talk for 45 minutes about grief and words about grief? And, this was great. I don't know. The one thing that I keep getting stuck on in this conversation, I asked this question before you came in the room of just, does grief ever end? And I'm actually not convinced that it does at this exact moment. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think maybe it's just like, I don't know, you're talking about, just the changing of things and like the changings of the backdrops of your life. And maybe this is just like a piece that sits there. I don't know if that resonates with anyone else, but I just start to feel that way. I'm like, maybe this is the acceptance part of like, no, the acceptance is that I'm going to be here forever. And not like the acceptance is like, I've accepted it. Now I'm at peace with this thing being gone. Does that make sense?
It does to me. Yeah. I mean, if grief is like referring to the experience of loss, then you don't get to a place where you didn't experience that loss, like that's always there. So it makes sense to me that you would say that.
It's a privilege to talk to somebody who, like, I think one of my favorite things, and I've been a visitor, and Lisa and I both have been, and why we were both drawn to journalism at early ages and, social impact film, all the things that we've done, is really getting to be a visitor in a lot of different spaces and getting to dip our toes in and learn a little about a lot of things and continue to learn more. But I always feel best when I have become proficient in something to the extent where I'm suddenly aware of, oh my God, I know nothing about this because there's so much more to know. And so I'm hearing that from you. Just, you obviously know so much about this topic, but to you, it's like you're this tiny little dot in an ocean of other things that you don't know and can't talk about. But that's the sweet spot for me, to learn from somebody who's there, because, I think once you are aware of how much you don't know and you realize you'll never stop learning about it, I think that's a really beautiful place to be in. So thank you so much for sharing your perspectives.
Thank you. That was really, really kind and felt really good to hear. So I super appreciate that. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah.
I agree with all of that. And thank you so much for being here with us. You're a dream to speak to. And Yeah, thanks for sharing your wisdoms, even wisdoms that you took from other people's wisdoms.
Yeah.
That are now back ours.
That we've butchered and claimed as our own.
Yes. Amen. That's the name of the game here.
Yep.
Thank you, Jessica. We appreciate
Thanks
you.
so much. All right.
Well, that was amazing. What do you think? I thought that was such like a fruitful conversation.
Yes, she's wonderful and absolutely brilliant. And, I think I hope it inspires people to examine how they think about grief and how they talk about it. I think, there's so much there and, not necessarily right or wrong, but I think we also have some reflection to do. Yes?
Yeah. I think there was at least 2 times in that conversation where stuff we said at the top of the show were challenged, which I thought was really interesting and I don't know, kind of a fun experience. Because, like, for example, how she talked about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, so graceful. And it actually is making me do this little reflection on myself where, how sometimes you want to prove that you're an expert in something by knowing all the right things to say. And then the other way that you can do that is by shitting on other things that you think are stupid. And I think I might have done that a little bit. And she just came in with this answer that was so graceful and so like, well, this goes here and this can be a part of this. And I think that's just like a really generous way to think about grief and all of the things, all of the feelings that are wrapped up in this. And there's really no reason to not approach it gracefully. So I really appreciate that she brought that to the conversation.
Yes, I do too. And I appreciate that, it's not about bashing the old ways. It's not about bashing, what we thought previously, what other people have said. It's not about entirely abandoning them. It's, recognizing their significance, but also coming in with, a growth mindset and again, like you said, a lot of grace, just respecting what has been done, what has been laid, and then talking about where we are now and from personal experiences. So I think
also what she said about scaffolding, I thought that was such a lovely way to put it because
definitely,
you get your scaffolding and then you build your house on it and it can be whatever you want. And I think that's really a cool way to think about it too of, take what you need, take what's useful and build around it.
Yeah,
really cool.
Absolutely. I think so too. Wonderful.
Well,
thanks,
I
Jessica.
think, literally, thank you so much for being our first guest. What a dream. But we do need to close out this podcast episode. So one big thing is that we are really, really interested in hearing what any listener thought of today's conversation. Is there something that you think we just very glaringly got wrong that you want to correct us on? Feel free. This is a safe space on the internet where you can just tell us that we're wrong. You should stop doing that everywhere else and start doing it here so that we can respond to you. And we will do a follow-up on our YouTube channel where we can dive into what people have said. We can correct ourselves after we listen to this back and realize that we said something ridiculous that we didn't notice yet. But I'm sure we'll notice it later. And then until then, we will be back next time with our next guest. Jessica said something about world building, about changing how you think about grief is a fight for world building. So I think I know exactly who to bring on. And we can get into that next time.
Woo. That's great. Thank you. Cheers to being wrong.
Yes, cheers to being wrong. We're great at it. I love it.